One of my favorite quotes that's ever been written about the restaurant was Carolyn Bates, who wrote for Gourmet magazine. And she said, I cannot imagine Los Angeles without El Cholo. And that one, I thought, that really describes it better than anything anybody's ever said about us. We are a Mexican restaurant, but more than that, we're a restaurant that's part of Los Angeles history and tradition, who coincidentally serves Mexican food. It almost becomes a byproduct of who we are and what we represent, because we have it now. We probably have, in some cases, 6, 7 generations that have dined with us. This all started in 1923 when my grandfather and grandmother on my mother's side were sitting around the dining room table one night, and my grandfather pushed back from the table and said to my grandmother, "You're such a good cook, we should start our restaurant." After that conversation at the dinner table, my grandfather went out and located a building that was situated at the corner of then it was called Manita in Santa Barbara, over by the LA Coliseum. Today it's Martin Luther King and Broadway. The rest was history. When they originally opened in 1923, since my relatives had originally come from the state of Sonora in Mexico, they called the restaurant Cholo Cafe. In 1925, a guest walked into the restaurant, pulled out his pencil and scribbled on one of the menus there, and then wrote underneath it El Cholo. My mother, who was the waitress at the time, took it to her dad and said, "Dad, what do you think of this?" And he was so taken by the name and the character, he said, "Okay, as of this moment, we're changing Cholo Cafe to El Cholo, and the man will become our logo." About the same time, my dad, who lived in the neighborhood, came in the restaurant to have lunch, fell in love with my mom, and they planned on getting married. They decided to open up their own El Cholo. So in 1927, they moved to which is now across the street from our present location here on Western, into a little tiny, it's kind of a storefront. In 1931, they moved across the street to our present location to what was then an early California bungalow. All those rooms were converted into dining rooms, and the kitchen of the house became the kitchen of the restaurant. My grandfather, who was such a generous man, wanting his daughter and her husband to succeed, was now sending all of his guests over here to the point where he almost went out of business. By this time, the restaurant had become so popular, and even though my dad couldn't afford to build a waiting room, they would line down the sidewalk. So people would drive by in their cars and see this long line, and of course, it was the absolutely best advertising you could have for the restaurant. When you saw a line like that, you figured it had to be good. When my dad and mom first started the restaurant, they basically had 3 pictures that they went down to Tijuana and bought in a little cheap curio store. As you look around the restaurant today, you see pictures and pictures and pictures, and there are 3 themes that we have followed. One is that we want people to realize that there really is a family involved with this restaurant, and so a great deal of pictures you see will be pictures of family, my immediate children, other relatives who've been associated with it. The other things we feel are very much a part, as I mentioned earlier, of California and Los Angeles history. So we've brought in I feel some very interesting pictures which depict that earlier era that existed. The third one is a lot of very interesting people have graced our restaurant here, and so I think people enjoy seeing who some of those interesting people are. So we've had them autograph pictures to us and hang those around. What you see in this restaurant is, as you can tell, a long shot from what it was in its early days. The booths were very interesting, and I think it's a very important part of coming to El Cholo is snuggling into these high back wooden booths. They were built in those days to accommodate people in the 20s and 30s and 40s. Obviously, as a society, we've all become much larger people. So where the booths came down like this and people had to kind of squeeze in, we finally had to end up cutting some of the edge of the booths out. So now it was, you could slide in and out more easily. There were no lights on the table, so we just had the little candles, the candles that you would have with the netting that you would see in the early Italian restaurants, and that's how we lit it. The walls were white stucco, and in those days, of course, people were much heavier smokers. And later on, we added fajitas, which had the smoke coming out of the fajitas. Well, you came in here and pretty soon these walls were very, very dark brown. And so this came as a natural process and gave it a very antique look, which was not painted on. It was a very natural process. We hired a lady to freshen things up, and she came in and we applied very tasteful paint in one of the rooms. I told Rosalind Smith, who was the designer, that she had now painted over all this years and years of antiquity. She just went white, and I almost felt like she was toying with history. Growing up, and we look back and we think about the earliest memories we have, and intertwined with mine, obviously, are memories of the restaurant. And I have memories of walking in the aromas of the freshly ground chili, the beans simmering on the stove. I was very fortunate to be part of growing up and having these sensations. Of course, they would play with me. I have to tell you one little story that everybody's going to tease the young kids. So in those days, part of the job that the waiters had was to cut the butter with these things that had little wires in it. You get it warm and then like that. And one of the servers said, "I'll bet you can't eat a pound of butter." And I was about 6 years old, and I said, "Oh, I bet I can." He said, "I'll give you $1 if you can eat a pound of butter." And so I started to eat the butter and eat the butter. And needless to say, I didn't get through the butter. I got pretty sick. A lot of the memories I have centered around the cash register, because in those days you didn't pay at the table. We didn't have credit cards. So everyone who would pay would come up and pay at the register. And I learned how to count by making change at the register. Across from the cash register was a large booth, and a lot of the neighborhood people would come in that were friends of my parents. They would, I remember they'd knock on the door. If you came in after 10 o'clock when it wrapped, they'd go boom, 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 boom. And if someone had that knock, we knew it was okay to look and let them in. They would come in at night and they'd have a little glass of sherry, they'd have a beef enchilada, and then they would sort the checks out for us. And that was, so the booth was kind of a meeting place for a lot of my friends of my parents. In front, our neon sign says El Cholo Spanish Cafe, and obviously we're not a Spanish cafe. In the early days, people did not know what Mexican food was. Instead of calling it Mexican, you called something Spanish. And when the time came to tear down or change, it didn't make any sense because it was part of our history. So we're the only Mexican restaurant, I guess, with a Spanish food sign out in front. Phones were different in those days. I grew up during a time when there were still party lines. So in your home, if you picked up the line and somebody's on there, it was because someone down the block was on that line. Here, my dad couldn't afford to have a regular phone, so there was a pay phone, which was just across the hallway from the desk. So if anyone wanted to call the restaurant, they had to call the pay phone. So that was the phone, the only phone we had. And because it cost a nickel in those days, I remember my dad and mom had a code. If my mom was home, it rang twice and then no ring. She knew, because the call from home was free, at that point she could call down the restaurant and they saved a nickel. My dad did not believe in hard liquor. As we evolved and changed, we realized in the 60s that you did need a bar now, and you obviously with a Mexican restaurant, you absolutely needed margaritas. A salesman approached us that we could make margaritas out of wine. So you had a white wine which you would blend with the margarita mix, and we served them for about maybe 8 or 9 months and realized they weren't good, but we didn't know how to make them better. There was a gentleman who used to dine in here by himself all the time, Emil Smith. Mr. Smith said to me, "Your margaritas aren't very good." He said, "Would you like me to show you how to make a really good margarita?" And I thought, what do I have to lose? He very gracefully showed me how he made these margaritas. I brought it back and said, "These are really good," and that was the beginning of our margaritas. I can never thank him enough for what he did. Today we'll still talk about someone who worked here because they were so incredible in their attitude and their approach to work. You'll still talk about them as if they're still here, and they may have passed away 30 years ago, and that never leaves you. And that is, I think, the wonderful thing about having a business that has that kind of love and roots to it. It will always be part of you